From failed double crosses to destroying drug tunnels to cocaine Jesus to even using an eccentric American movie star to bring down one of history's most notorious drug lords. These are 9 times cartels tried the US and got humiliated. Number 9. Operation Casablanca. In 1998, the US Customs Service hit the Cali and Juarez cartels where it hurt, their extremely fat wallets. After sending hundreds of millions of dollars of life-destroying drugs into the US, it left the cartels with a challenge of where to launder that money in order to turn their ill-gotten gains into clean liquid cash. The answer was working with a large number of Mexican and Central American banks who were willing to look the other way as long as some of the proceeds were kicked upstairs as a thanks. Customs wanted to put a stop to this, so it began Operation Casablanca, one of the largest anti-money laundering operations in history. It was a 3-year undercover investigation across 6 countries, and it led to over 100 arrests, the seizure of tens of millions in laundered cash, 2 tons of cocaine, and 4 tons of marijuana. So how did Customs pull it off? Well, back in 1995, they infiltrated the financial operations of the Cali and Juarez cartels at their highest levels. Agents were put in place to discover and study the financial dark magic going on behind the scenes. The investigations found that 12 of Mexico's 19 largest banking institutions were in some way culpable in cartel money laundering schemes. By tracking the movement of the cash, they could implicate huge numbers of officials and cartel members all the way across this elaborate crime web. Attorney General Janet Reno, one of the key figures in plotting the operation, said, "We set out to disrupt the money laundering networks that fuel the international drug trafficking trade, and we succeeded." The undercover agents often acted as fake brokers for both the cartels and the banks. They made deals to squirrel away dirty money that they would later use to nail the people involved to the wall. But it wasn't just Mexican banks that they found involved. Some banks in Venezuela were implicated, and there were even 100 U.S. bank accounts connected to the case. Even the Federal Reserve pitched in to the crackdown efforts, engaging in enforcement actions against the foreign banks that Operation Casablanca had exposed. In the end, it all added up to one humiliating situation for the Juarez and Cali cartels, thanks to the hard work of the U.S. Customs Service. But money isn't the only thing that the U.S. authorities take from the cartels. Number 8. Busting the San Diego drug tunnel. Say what you will about drug cartels, they can be extremely creative when figuring out ways to smuggle drugs into the U.S. From hiding them in people's stomachs, they call those folks body packers, to hiding them inside of dead animals. They even use custom-made submarines called narco subs that can carry huge amounts of narcotics underwater without detection. But one of the most ingenious methods, pioneered by the Sinaloa cartel back in the 1990s, is the use of cartel drug tunnels. Plenty of these are dug below the US-Mexico border, allowing huge quantities of cocaine to travel right underneath the border guards who are supposed to intercept it. But a cartel can only push its luck so far before getting caught. Back in 2016, U.S. authorities uncovered what may have been the longest cartel tunnel ever discovered, an elaborate underground passage used for smuggling. This so-called super tunnel was over 2,600 feet, leading directly from the edge of Mexico to San Diego. The Mexican end was at the bottom of an elevator shaft built in a cartel-owned house in Tijuana. The American end was within the fenced-in lot of a pallet front business, also secretly owned by the cartel. Drugs were placed into a dumpster positioned above the hole. The dumpster would be moved to a secondary location to distribute the drugs to their dealer network, until the whole plot was foiled by the San Diego County Sheriff's Office, who saw several drug pushers loading the product into a pickup truck. They swooped in and arrested all involved, and then led a raid on the site of the super tunnel. While this wasn't the first super tunnel from Mexico to the U.S., in fact it was actually the 13th, it was unquestionably the most ambitious. Authorities in San Diego seized a shipment of almost 2,200 pounds of cocaine and 14,000 pounds of marijuana through this tunnel before shutting it down for good. According to Southern California District Attorney Laura Duffy, it was the largest cocaine seizure ever associated with a tunnel. But that pales in comparison to the value of taking a gang of genuine cold-blooded killers off of the streets once and for all. Number 7. The El Paso sicarios. On December 28, 2022, a 35-year-old man named Alonso Llamas Chavez was assassinated by a gunman with a rifle outside the 1111 bar in El Paso, Texas. The gunman jumped into a prepared getaway vehicle and was driven away from what seemed like a completely senseless act of violence, along with several unknown accomplices. But the truth was a lot deeper and somehow even darker. In 2024, 20-year-old Brandon Alexis Garcia was arrested in connection with the murder by El Paso police. It turned out that Garcia had connections to a people smuggling cartel and often acted as a sicario or a hitman on their behalf. Several months later, another perpetrator of the crime, Gael Hernandez Ruiz, only 19, was also arrested. They were believed to be 2 of the 4 killers involved in the assassination, and between them they helped run a coyote ring on behalf of their human trafficking cartel. They smuggled undocumented immigrants across the southern border in dangerous conditions. There was considerable evidence connecting these guys to the crime, from witnesses placing them in the area to photos posted of the men with similar rifles to the one used to gun down Mr. Chavez. Far from being the John Wicks and Lalo Salamancas of fiction, these sicarios were rank amateurs, and the El Paso authorities more than embarrassed them for their sloppy criminality. How about another slice of a Texas victory that the cartels really felt in their pocketbooks? Number 6. 14 tons of Texas cocaine. In October 1989, Texas narcotic agents made history by performing 2 incredible raids against cartel forces on the same day. In the first, they infiltrated and besieged a house near the Mexican border. According to Mike Cox, a spokesman for the Department of Public Safety, the house was, quote, literally stuffed with cocaine, smuggled in directly from Bogota, Colombia. And this isn't an exaggeration. They found that the house was stuffed with duffel bags of genuine Colombian Bam Bam, weighing a nose-bleeding total of nearly 18,000 pounds. 3 men were arrested in connection with this utterly insane stash. But that wasn't the only raid on that historic day of impressive strikes against the cartel's plans. A Panamanian ship bound for the U.S. was intercepted by the Coast Guard, who searched it and found 9,500 pounds of cocaine, $186 million worth to be exact. Between the 2 busts, 14 tons of cocaine were confiscated, and this wasn't long after 20 tons of cocaine were confiscated from a suburban Los Angeles warehouse. Needless to say, that was a real bad month for the cartel's profit margins. But it is nothing compared to how weird our next U.S. victory against the cartels is. Number 5. U.S. Customs intercepts Cocaine Jesus. While it's nowhere near the biggest blow against the cartel on this list, believe us, we've got some truly astounding stuff on that coming up. This might be the one you're most likely to remember once the video is done. When we say Cocaine Jesus, we're not talking about the nickname of a drug trafficker with a long beard who claims that he could walk on water. No, we meant an actual statue of Jesus Christ made entirely out of cocaine. It all starts with a drug dealer called the Spider, real name unknown, who had a genius plan to get $30,000 worth of cocaine across the border in Laredo, Texas. And that plan was to form the cocaine up into an extremely tacky-looking statue of Jesus, the kind that you would see sold to borderland tourists with too much money burning holes in their pockets. But the Spider wasn't going to do the deed himself. No, he offered a woman only $80, yes, $80, for a quantity of cocaine that would put a person away for life in order to smuggle it across the border. Once across, a contact would take the holy narcotics to Dallas, where the Spider planned to break it down and sell it to his eager customers. This plan failed, because it obviously did, when a drug sniffer dog on the border started freaking out in the presence of Christ. No, the dog wasn't possessed by demons. It smelled the drugs coming off of that gaudy piece of religious iconography. Both the woman and the contact she was meant to sell the statue to in Dallas were arrested, but the Spider managed to crawl away before anyone could arrest him for his part in this wacky crime. The moral of this bizarre little story? If a guy who calls himself the Spider asks you to take a statue of Jesus across the US-Mexico border for a comically small amount of cash, maybe just decline. Number 4. Operation Tiburon. There have been a lot of extremely successful counter-drug operations in U.S. history. This one is the only one that literally has an entry in the Guinness Book of World Records. Operation Tiburon, Spanish for shark, was a massive joint operation by the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the U.S. Coast Guard, the U.S. Customs Service, and local authorities in Colombia. The purpose was simple: to disrupt and potentially even dismantle the powerful cartel smuggling frameworks that were shipping thousands of tons of marijuana into the United States. The operation ran from late 1980 to early 1982, and by all accounts, it was one of the most resounding successes in the history of American anti-drug efforts. It was a perfect example of the power of international law enforcement cooperation. There were 3 different major raids, as well as the use of nets to intercept waterbound marijuana packages. 495 people were arrested in connection with the scheme, a serious hit to Colombian drug cartels. U.S. authorities were able to confiscate 1.7 million pounds of marijuana. Meanwhile, Colombian authorities, with American guidance, were able to seize an additional 4.7 million pounds. It was a total of 6.4 million pounds of ganja pulled off the streets in only 14 months. 95 vessels smuggling the weed were also captured, putting another serious dent into cartel operations. And how big of a dent? The amount they were able to capture represented a whopping 20% of the total marijuana quantity that entered the United States every year around that time. The street value of the captured pot was anywhere from $35.8 billion to $46 billion, and we're talking 80s money. Adjusting for inflation, that'd be an even more insanely huge figure. U.S. Attorney General William French Smith proudly called it, quote, the most successful international marijuana interdiction effort to date, and he's got that Guinness record to prove it. Now let's talk about how the U.S. got two of the most powerful and dangerous figures in modern drug trafficking under lock and key. Number 3. The arrest of El Mayo. As El Chapo's invaluable right-hand man for decades, it's fair to say that Ismael El Mayo Zambada was the Michael Jordan of drug trafficking. Back in the 90s, El Chapo and the early Sinaloa cartel were at war with the Juarez cartel for dominance following the collapse of the Guadalajara cartel. And El Mayo was the tiebreaker that brought his boss the dub. And when El Chapo was first in jail, El Mayo was the man he trusted to take up the reins. Using his skills as an ace freelance drug trafficker, he was able to grow the cartel to even greater heights, even forming alliances with some of the cartels the Sinaloas once warred with. He was also notoriously slippery. Unlike a lot of his cartel co-workers, he had never ever been arrested until he made the mistake of setting foot on U.S. soil. But this plot wasn't actually conceived by the U.S. It started as a plot of betrayal by one of El Chapo's very own sons, Joaquin Guzman Lopez. After El Chapo was first extradited to the U.S. in 2017, a turf war broke out between who would run the Sinaloa cartel. El Chapo's sons, known as Los Chapitos, claimed that it was their birthright. El Mayo, whose work with their father had built the cartel to what it is in the first place, naturally thought that he should be the new jefe. Lopez had a clever plot to take the 76-year-old El Mayo out of the picture back in 2024. He'd lured the elderly drug lord out to El Paso, Texas, in a private plane, telling him that he was going to help him purchase some property there. And then he would hand El Mayo over to the authorities and let them do his dirty work. There was one little hitch in Lopez's plan here, though. He had severely underestimated U.S. law enforcement. When El Mayo and Lopez landed on the tarmac in El Paso, neither of them would ever be leaving to return to their home country again. The duo and their men were quickly arrested by U.S. authorities and pled guilty to a litany of charges in Texas federal court. In one of the few interviews he had given throughout his secretive life, El Mayo said that going to prison was his greatest fear. We can only hope that facing his fears like this will be a character-building experience for the guy. But El Mayo's arrest didn't practically lead to the downfall of an entire cartel. Our next example, on the other hand? Number 2. The clever takedown of Benjamin Arellano Felix. While it doesn't have as much name recognition as some of the other cartels on this list, for a time the Tijuana cartel was a real force to be reckoned with. Founded by the Arellano Felix family, the criminal group made billions manufacturing and trafficking cocaine into the United States. But 2 major wins from the U.S. left them an embarrassed wreck of their former selves. The first was how the DEA's interesting methods were pivotal in taking down the violent and infamous gang leader, Benjamin Arellano Felix. As the senior member of this enterprising group of cartel siblings, he was involved in everything from smuggling to assassination, even being implicated in the 1993 murder of Cardinal Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo. His financial empire stretched across both Mexico and the U.S., giving him a strong foothold in each country. That is, until the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act was used to sanction nasty old Ben, freezing his U.S. assets. Eventually, he went underground and it seemed like nobody would ever find him. But the DEA still had one feather in their cap. Ben's oldest daughter was one of the few things he loved unconditionally, even as an otherwise ruthless drug lord. And his daughter, who lived with her mother and siblings in Southern California, also had a rare and distinct facial deformity that made her extremely easy to track. So the DEA monitored their comings and goings, especially when they were heading to Tijuana for some sightseeing. Of course, the daughter couldn't stay separated from her dear old dad forever. When they met up, U.S. federales swooped in and arrested Ben. He was shocked at first, but then he accepted his fate and surrendered, saying that he was tired of running. The U.S. dealt a further blow to the Tijuana cartel in 2006. Its new leader, Francisco Javier Arellano Felix, was arrested by the U.S. Coast Guard while trying to smuggle his goods off the coast of Baja California. By 2016, they were so feeble against the growing power of the Sinaloa cartel that they were forced to team up with the Jalisco New Generation cartel and the Beltran Leyva organization, with the Tijuana forces sitting at the bottom of the chain of command. Speaking of the Sinaloa cartel, number 1. The extradition of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman. The Sinaloa cartel, as you've probably put together by now, is one of the most dangerous and successful drug cartels in the history of drug dealing. At their peak, the cartels raked in anywhere from $3 to $39 billion a year, giving them the power to operate with near impunity. They've trafficked drugs, murdered rivals and law enforcement, and corrupted the very government forces meant to stop them for decades. And the kingpin behind it all was Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, perhaps the most famous drug lord since Pablo Escobar ran his Medellin cartel in Colombia. However, all empires crumble eventually, and El Chapo's life's work was no exception. He had already proven himself to be an escape artist back in Mexico. First, he escaped from his cell in a laundry hamper. Later, he busted out in a motorcycle in an underground tunnel built beneath the prison. Of course, in both instances, he had corrupt officials in the prison giving him a hand. As long as he remained in Mexico, the nerve center for his base of support, he would always have a way to escape if he wanted to. When actor Sean Penn went to Mexico in order to interview El Chapo, for whatever reason, Mexican federales trailed him to the sleazy motel in Los Mochis where the drug lord was hiding out. He was seized and, having exhausted all of his appeals against extradition, was put on a plane to New York for a U.S. trial and sentencing. Every Mexican gangster's worst nightmare. Of course, he was found guilty on a bevy of counts, and he'll spend the rest of his life in ADX Florence without the possibility of parole, cutting the head off the Sinaloa snake. Now check out Undercover Agent who spent 24 months in a Mexican cartel, or watch this instead.